Hey guys, welcome to today's video. My name's Adam, I'm an ancient Greek reenactor and history enthusiast, and today I had the privilege of interviewing Martin Kleckner, who was the creator of the short film Heroes of Bronze, which I'd highly recommend you check out. We'll let him introduce himself.
Originally, I started with studying film direction. I studied at film school, but then it gradually, during my studies, it got me on a different path, and I got into visual effects and 3D graphics and animation. And I started freelancing, so that taught me a lot, and I learned a lot of 3D software there. I'm based in Czech Republic, by the way, so
Okay.
there's a lot of generalists needed because we don't have much room for specialization. Usually when clients come, they want you to know everything, so that taught me a lot. And then I got an opportunity through some student works that I did and some client work. I got an opportunity to work on Kingdom Come Deliverance. It's a RPG game.
Yeah, I've played that actually, it's a great game.
Awesome. So yeah, it's awesome to hear that people actually play it.
Yeah.
Never believed it before the release, so that's crazy.
It's quite popular.
It is.
And I think there's quite a drive for a second one to come out.
Yeah, I can't say any information about that. But anyways, it was a great experience, the biggest probably of my life so far. It's like a team of 100 people all working on the same thing, and I was in charge of a small team of cinematic artists, making the 4 hours of the cinematics for the game become like reality in the game.
That's super cool.
And I also did some trailers for that game, so that was like that was the last touch after everything was finished. I got to make my own trailer, so that was awesome. And I always told the leaders of the company that I would be leaving after we finish the game, and I wanted to make my own project. I wanted to get back freelancing and working from home, because that lifestyle kind of suits me. So I did, and I started working on my own project, and that was Heroes of Bronze.
And
so 10 years in a nutshell.
Wow. How long did this short film take you?
Before Heroes of Bronze, I had 10 years of a professional career, and then these last 4 years I've been working on Heroes of Bronze.
It's 4 years, and it's kind of like a passion project.
Yeah,
it was really good. I really enjoyed watching it. Can you sort of give a quick summary of the film, just in case some people haven't watched it, which I would highly recommend they do?
It's a 6-minute short film, kind of a proof of concept, or like an introduction to a world that I want to build. And it's essentially the story of a father and son. Basically, the son is living in the shadow of his father's exploits, and in the short film, he remembers his father, who has fallen at the Battle of Marathon. And I don't want to spoil the rest for anybody who wants to watch it.
All right. And so what was the process? Like, how did you start and actually execute the final finished product?
It started, I've been doing some experimentation after I left the Kingdom Come project. I've been doodling stuff, various fantasy concept art and historical concept art, because that was the topic that drew me most at the time. And gradually I realized that doodling concept art set in ancient Greece was the most fun for me, and I kept coming back to that topic. I kept reading books about the topic, and gradually I even started making my own 3D models and models of hoplites, their gear, and it was awesome. I loved every step, and I realized, I should use these models for something more. And I think it was probably 2018, late 2018, when I created this artwork of a little boy standing by a hoplite armor, and that created the idea for Heroes of Bronze and the short film. So it started with a simple artwork made in 3D, and I built from there.
Wow. So it's really started off quite minimal, and then you decided to grow it into something really large. So yeah, sort of like you kind of touched on it there, but what made you choose ancient Greece as opposed to another era? Like you had experience with Kingdom Come Deliverance. So what made you choose ancient Greece instead of like the 15th century?
I've worked on medieval projects for those past probably 8 years. I did some student projects, which were set in Middle Ages, and then I just transitioned to Kingdom Come. And even though I love Middle Ages, it's not really my most beloved topic. But I can't really tell you why I love ancient times so much. I always loved Rome, and then I played the game Rome Total War, of course.
Oh yeah.
But gradually, like throughout the years, I became more interested in ancient Greece somehow, and the time really speaks to me. It feels maybe a bit more adventurous than ancient Rome to me. So I really like the idea of those little independent city-states of ancient Greece, all battling each other and the Persians. Then I don't really like the topic of the Peloponnesian War because I feel like it's this big mess that they created afterwards. So I really like to stick to that period of the Greco-Persian Wars.
So the Greco-Persian Wars is probably the most famous event that happened in ancient Greek history. What made you choose Marathon as opposed to maybe more famous battle like Thermopylae?
Well, I didn't want to really make another 300. The initial idea was if I was making something focused on ancient Greece, I really wanted to depict hoplites and ancient Greek world more realistic. Not guys in underpants, but heavily armored guys, how it probably looked like. So that was the initial idea. But then I started studying a lot about that topic, and I realized I don't really like Spartans that much because their society kind of, I don't know, it doesn't speak to me that much, and they somehow feel a little bit dimensional to me. I don't want to sound negativistic here, but
Oh no, that's fine.
somehow they don't feel like the right fit for me. And even though Athenians, they can be extreme in their own way, I somehow opted towards them and started studying more about Athens and started building the story focusing on Athens. So I have some sympathies before the Peloponnesian War. I have sympathies for Athens, and I really love their history. So that's why I picked this city instead of the Spartans and the famous Battle of Thermopylae.
Yeah. I think that's a term that most people, when they first start to get into ancient Greece, they either go to the Sparta route or the Athens route. And I think both of them, once you get more into them, both reveal that they have really cool aspects and some also really bad aspects to them. But I think that's just what makes them so fascinating. So what was your main goal with this film? Did you want obviously you based it heavily on historical influence, but was your goal more entertainment or historical, or sort of a mixture of the two?
First off, I think it was the historical aspect. I wanted, the first idea was to show how ancient Greece and this period could have looked. But of course, I'm not a historian, so I had my limits, and I was building a story, and I chose some different story choices that are probably not that historically correct, and I know about most of them, but I made some intentional errors there. We can talk about it maybe later. But initially, I wanted to start with showing history, but then I started building the characters and building the world, and realized I really want to make it like a fun project, showing various characters in that world and build a larger story around it.
I think you did a really great job with that. When I watched the short film, there was a few things that I absolutely loved. I love how you included color in the buildings and the statues. I love that because in so many common depicted ancient Greek and Roman, it's just white marble. And I think I really love you nailed the Acropolis, the Parthenon was painted. The clothes were all super bright colored. Even some of the armor was painted, and just as me watching it, I was just like, thank you so much. I love that you included that. And you also included things like the Hoplitodromos, the running in armor, and stuff like that. And I really loved how you incorporated that into a short 6-minute film. How much research did you have to do to come up with that world?
I started with some fiction books. I really fell in love with the Long War series by Christian Cameron. If you know, I read it like 4 times already. I feel I will be reading it some more. But then I like went for some non-fiction books, so like the Western Way of War, and some books about Athenians. I can't really remember the names now, but I have a library full of books such as that, and I studied a lot of them. I like for a whole year I kept reading and reading. So I had a lot of notes. I went specifically for notes on the topic that I wanted to depict. So I learned a lot of stuff that wasn't clear to me at first. Like the symbols of the shields weren't the same at the time I was depicting. There wasn't just one unified symbol on the army's shields, but everyone had essentially different symbols on their shields. And yeah, another aspect was that I learned that the temples were actually full of colors, and the statues as well.
Yeah.
Like a full year of really diving into books, and then I kept reading and reading. But those last 3 years of the development of the short film, it was more me diving into 3D instead of books.
And I love how you really managed to replicate, with some creative influence, but like the Acropolis of Athens is a scene where there's a like horse-drawn cart, and it just really captures like what it would have looked like almost if you went back in time. And even the Battle of Marathon, when you see they're planning out with the little stones over the rock, and you see the little bay that all the Persian ships are in and stuff like that, is exactly what Marathon was. There was a bay where the ships are in. And I love how you didn't include a bird's eye view map. You included the sort of stones moving around, because they didn't have maps like that back then. So how much did you have to look at the geography of the sections that the battles took place to sort of map that in the 3D world?
Oh yeah. Well, in those books that I read, there were a lot of little maps that I studied, and I I wanted to go to the Bay of Marathon, but actually there was this when I went to Athens several years ago. There was this big fire, and it prevented me from going there.
Oh.
I didn't get a chance to see Marathon, but I studied Google Maps. That helped as well. And I actually, for the Marathon scene, I downloaded some satellite data, some 3D satellite data, and it's not completely like real life, but I tried to at least get the topology right of the bay. So yeah, I tried to get as many sources as I could get.
Yeah, I think you did it really good, because there's just a few things about that I noticed. It's like you actually did research that battle, which I really appreciated. I also love you include the thinned Athenian center in the formations, and that was such a crucial part to the battle itself, because we don't know necessarily whether it was a deliberate act or whether it was just to simply make the Athenian force wider. But that was what made them essentially win the battle, because the heavy Persian force pushed through, and the Athenian flanks, after beating back the Persian flanks, managed to come back around. And I just really appreciated how you managed to include loads of really small details like that maybe someone that's not super into the historical parts would really recognize, but you still really put the effort in to do that. And
I wasn't completely sure whether they staged the battle like with their side to the sea or with Persian's backs to the sea.
Yes.
That was one thing I was like unsure about, but eventually I decided on having their sides oriented towards the sea, as you can see in the short.
Yeah, I did recently. I made a documentary on the Battle of Marathon on the channel, and there's sort of two we don't know completely. There's I forget what the mountain's called, but there's one where their sides to the coast and it's a longer but wider bottleneck, and then there's another mountain that would be if the Persians' backs were to the sea, and we don't actually know which way they came from. And funny enough, I settled in the documentary as well, coming from the side to the sea as well. So it's interesting that we both chose the same one there.
When I looked at the maps and the topology, I felt like the more logical solution. But what do we know?
Yeah. One thing I also loved is you included, I think it was Darius's palace, as a quick little shot. And I love how my Persian architecture knowledge is not that great, but from what I could see, it still looked like that even for that small scene, you still put a lot of detail into the clothes that the Persians had and the buildings. And so how much research did you have to put into the Persian side of it as well?
Well, I have 4 books here, and it's the city of Susa, the winter capital, I think, of Persian Empire, and before Persepolis, and there's not many images of that place, or at least I couldn't find that many, and there are just ruins these days. So I saw some blueprints, like the basis of the city, and tried to replicate that. And there is actually one image. I think it's from History Illustrated. I can't really tell you by who painted it, but I based my model of that city on that image. So historyillustrated.com, I think I recommend to everyone.
Perfect. And another thing I really liked, you also included not just the land battles, but also the naval battles. And I think that you managed to capture the ships really nicely. I also love how you included coloured sails and stuff like that. And one thing that I noticed was there was in one scene, they clipped the side of the ship and knock all the oars off, which would have been a difficult maneuver to do, but it was something that I believe we have ancient sources mentioning as sort of like the best attack to do if you want to immobilize a ship. And then they jump on and they fight like that. And I think that was super cool to sort of include as sort of like, I know some people commented that it was maybe a little bit unbelievable. I'm like, but it looks cool, you know?
That's exactly, that was one of those points where alright, so probably with this maneuver, they would probably stop by the other ship, and only then they would jump over the gap. You know, having it like this, it was so much cooler. So yeah,
definitely. I think it made a super cool cinematic shot. In fact, the whole opening where he's sort of in that little cove and you see the ship sailing past and stuff like that. I think it's an artistic masterpiece as well as a cinematic masterpiece. I think it was really, really well done.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
If I could get back to the Battle of Marathon, there's this probably the biggest problem, and that's the cavalry there.
Yes.
So that's I know that most of the sources say that the cavalry was missing. From what I gathered, again, there's not like a clear idea about how it went down. And though most of the cavalry was probably at the time of the battle loaded on the ships, probably sailing away, I worked with an idea. What if like little part of the cavalry stayed, just to, you know, for all cases, and because when you look at the shot in the short film, there's not too many horsemen there actually. It looks like a huge charge, but there's not that many of them. So I worked with the idea if like a small regiment stayed behind and to cover maybe the archers or anything, and they saw the very thin center of the Athenian line. What if they decided to just punch through? I know that the saddles maybe, because they didn't have range, right, at the time of Marathon, so the saddles weren't the most stable for the riders. So probably punching through an armored line wasn't the option at the time. But then again, that was the second case where I decided to go for more like a cool,
a cinematic charge as opposed to historical. And I think that's a very important thing to do, especially when you're making essentially like a film, is you have to know, like, obviously basing it in historicalness, if you're basing it on historical events, is really important. But I think taking things like that, which a modern viewer would anticipate a cavalry charge, because we see it so much, I think that, yeah, it's really interesting because we don't know really where the cavalry were. We know that, like, Herodotus tells us that one of the reasons the Persians chose Marathon was because it was good for cavalry use, but then we're not told they are used in the battle. So it is a really interesting sort of situation, because, like, well, in one case we know that they were there, but then we're also told that they weren't used. And I think it's highly possible that there was a scouting group or something which was present at Battle of Marathon. It's just the bulk of the force wasn't. And I know some people on the Hoplite group said that they were predominantly missile cavalry that the Persians used. That's probably true, but then I had an interview with John Conyard earlier on the channel, who's he's a cavalry everything. He knows literally everything. I don't understand how he knows so much information. And he said that they would sometimes have charged, and I just think that in that scene it works better having the charge because you already had the archers shooting at them. So I think personally that was a good choice to include. One thing that I really love that you included in Marathon and Plataea later on is the phalanx running, because those are, funnily enough, the only two battles I believe that we really have documented the fact that they ran, and that was most likely to cover themselves from the Persian archers. So I also really appreciate how you include little details like that. And though the phalanx isn't necessarily as heavily formationed as perhaps it would have been historically, you still sort of included that they stayed in the line. I love how all the armor is different for all the different hoplites. The shield blazons are all slightly different, and you included so many sort of little details. Though it's not necessarily perfectly historical, it's historical rooted with a sort of fantasy flair, which I think works really well for the way that the film is created.
That's what I aimed at. That's like a little bit larger than life depiction at that time. So glad to hear it.
I also thought you included lots of little details like the shield curtains. Some of them have, which is a commonly neglected historical detail, which is seen decently commonly on Vars art, is the little curtains. I also love, I noticed in one of the scenes you include the full armor on one of the hoplites, which is also something which would be around in the era of Marathon and Thermopylae, but is also commonly neglected. So there's lots of little details which you could miss in a blink of an eye, but you still included. What made you want to include all those little details?
First year of making this short film, I had real fun of making all sorts of armor that I either saw on the Emperor or actually in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. So I played that game, it influenced me. I saw some pieces that I really wanted to make, but I also wanted to put it together with the historical information that I got from the books, and there came about this wild mix of little bit fantasy inspired elements with historical elements, and that's how it ended up in the movie. I just had so much fun making it, so I included all those little details. And when it comes to the arm cover for Alkaios in the Battle of Plataea, I actually decided to use it because his hand model looked really bad somehow from that angle. So I just covered it with bronze and said, maybe they could have worn that at the time, so why not?
Yeah, it's interesting because commonly it's the upper armor which is seen, but we do also have some evidence for the forearm as well, which is what you did include. And I did notice there's one armor, I think it's at the Plataea charge, and the guy's screaming as the Persians run down, and his armor looks super familiar to me, and then I remember it looked a lot like the polymark armor that the Spartans wore in Odyssey. Was that one of the ones that you based the armor on?
Probably, yes, probably. I took a lot of concept art from Odyssey and remade some of those assets. I hope it's not stealing. I just remade it on my own, so probably inspired there.
And one thing I also really loved is, I'm a massive advocate for the painted armor. There's sort of like a whole divide, or it's like, did they paint it, did they didn't? And you did include on the main armor through the Father and the Son, it has a painted face. And that was one thing that I really liked, because I think sometimes people get so hooked on the knight in shining armor almost aesthetic that it was all super shiny, just metal. And that was just one thing that I liked that you included as well, is just sort of a subtle detail, but there is actually paint on the armor and stuff like that. And the main cuirass that he's wearing is a form of muscle cuirass, but it has the sort of the swirly bits on the chest. And it's really interesting because the sort of famous muscle cuirass is actually more of a later design, but the way that you've included the swirls is sort of a transitional fade from the archaic bell cuirass to the classical muscle cuirass. which includes that. And that's another thing that I really like. There's a really prominent vase depiction, which I'll see if I can put up on the screen, that basically looks exactly like the cuirass that you gave the main characters. And you also included types of linothorax and stuff like that. And I think that you did a really good job at sort of capturing the non-uniform army of the Greeks as opposed to the more uniform Persian army. I think you did a really nice job.
One thing, sorry to interrupt, but on this topic, one thing I really wanted to include was I think you have it too on your helmet, the transverse crest.
Yes.
And then I learned that didn't really wear it, or like Spartan officers wore it, but not
it's
many others.
super interesting because we really don't know. So we know it originated in Laconia, or like the region that Sparta is, and we know that the amount that they wore it was a lot less than regulars, which is said some to specify that it was a Polemarchoi, like the head of one of the Locagoi or whatever like that would wear it, and that would explain why it's so few. But then there's also an issue, which is that most vase depictions depict hoplites from the side. And painting a transverse crest from the side is a lot more difficult, and every depiction we have of a transverse crest is from a front face. So it's really interesting to sort of think, then sort of later, during sort of the Peloponnesian War era, it becomes more common in ancient Greece throughout, not just Sparta, but also art started to change. So there's sort of a whole blank spot where like we know it was less common, but it could be attributed to this reason, it could be attributed to this reason, and we sort of don't know. So yeah, I'm sort of on the fence. I think that maybe early on it was a sort of Spartan command crest, but then became more widespread later.
Yeah, right. Well, that seems like logical option.
It's sort of an unknown spot, and there's lots of areas in ancient Greece and probably just history in general where you think something because it's in the past is like, oh, we know everything about it. But then you realise, no, there's probably more stuff we don't know than we actually know. And I think that's really cool. I also love how you included lots of coloured crests and like the blue stripes and stuff like that. And we know that they had dye and stuff like that. So I think it was really cool that you sort of included the very bright colours in with the armour in a believable way, but also like not super like just natural crests. And I think that was super cool because you sort of had a collection of like dyed, non-dyed, and a big variety in the armies.
I actually included even like an archaic bell cuirass on one of the warriors, like in Nikephoros' band, the main hero's band.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was that he just, got it from his great, grandparents and or grandfather, and he just took it into battle once again. And yeah, I think at that time he even has the armored shoulder and the armored hand, and even the legs are covered in bronze. It's really like a blast from the past. But
yeah.
Again, I decided to push it a little bit in case of one warrior.
Yeah, well, that's another thing I really liked, is you showed the armor being passed down by generation, like father to son. And that would have been the case for many hoplites because they weren't professionals. So invariably armor would be passed down and slightly modified from generation to generation. And funnily enough, the that armor that you just described actually would have been around in the Persian Wars, the sort of the full armor. It just starts to drop off for whatever reason. We're not really sure why. But there's there's a bronze figure which I'm basing my new armor on that I'm getting commissioned. And he's dated to around 550 BC, and he has full arm armor, full leg armor, and stuff like that. It's really interesting to see how they go from this basically full armor coverage to in the Peloponnesian War losing everything basically in some cases. And with that being said, is there any plans for another type of film like this? Are there a continuation or maybe I know you said you're not a massive fan of the Peloponnesian War, but a Peloponnesian War era one?
I'd like to expand this story actually, and I'm writing fiction. Like I finished a short story now, and the first book in the series, and I have lots of work to do to finish up the whole story. But I have it planned for like 6 parts, and eventually, Yeah, a lot of work, and eventually the ultimate goal is to make a TV series out of it. But that's the future.
That would be so awesome. 'Cause one thing I also noticed is you released some teaser trailers and stuff like that before the film came out. There were some clips which weren't present in the film that were present in the trailer. So are they going to possibly show up in later renditions, or are they just sort of more of a little clip that you cut from the main film?
The thing is, I have the larger story in mind, and I have various bits and pieces of the characters' stories already planned. So I was creating test shots even before I finished up here, like the short film. I was creating test shots to test my abilities and the look of the film, but they are still parts of the bigger story. So they may return in the future, but I'm still I still have to work out what my next video shall be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't want to promise anything right now.
Yeah, for sure. It's a big thing to live up to.
And one thing I'm really considering is like accompany the stories that I'm writing with short, maybe even shorter than this one, but short videos. So probably if I did something next, it would be about the Union Revolt before
Mhm.
Greco-Persian Wars and the fall of Miletus.
Yeah, that would be super interesting because that's sort of what sparked the Battle of Marathon was on the Athenians, because they actually sort of made peace with the Persians. They offered them earth and water because before the Battle of Marathon, Athens was under threat from a few other city-states, including Sparta. So they actually begged the Persians to help them. So they sort of aligned themselves with the Persians. Then when the Ionians revolted, they broke the alliance by sending aid. And I think that's also a super interesting thing, which is sort of commonly not shown, is that why the Battle of Marathon happened. That would be a really cool area to explore as well.
That's where my story, the whole story begins with the revolt at Naxos and then the siege of Miletus.
Hmm. And you have sort of video game experience with Kingdom Come Deliverance. Do you think that there will be a chance that we can get an ancient Greek game similar to Kingdom Come Deliverance?
Well, I've seen how very difficult it is to make a project like that. If there was humongous funding, it would be amazing, and I would be the first one to either make it or play it. But currently, not really, because yeah, I've seen firsthand how much does such a thing cost, and I can't really imagine making it at this point. And really, like making the story, finishing the story of these characters that I fleshed out, is my main goal now.
Hmm. All right. I think you should try and do that. That would be such an awesome thing.
Yeah.
10 years from now, we have a Kingdom Come Deliverance Ancient Greek edition. That would be super cool. Yeah, is there anything that you sort of want to talk about the film that I didn't maybe ask or anything like that?
Yeah, I remembered a third thing that I intentionally made wrong in the short film that I wanted to mention. Kind of apologize for it. That was the Athenian line at the end of the short film is standing against Persians, but actually, in reality, they stood against Thebans, which were Greeks,
Yes.
allied to the Persian cause. So again, for the purpose of simplicity and to make everybody understand, I made them stand against Persians.
I think some people might have been confused, like, hold on, they're fighting other Greeks. Yeah, I think that's one thing that lots of people also, is that there was actually more Greeks fighting for the Persians than against during the Persian Wars. But yeah, I noticed a little bit like that, but then again, yeah, I think just for the way that the film works, I think it works better sort of having them fight the Persians and sort of ends with the big clash.
Yeah.
Another thing I noticed is you decided to go with the underarm spear grip instead of the overarm spear grip. Did you choose, was that easier, or why did you choose that?
Not really. I have a mixture. I try to mix it up so somebody. I thought about the most probable way these things might have happened, and it was knowing that the Greeks weren't really like unified in their training for these battles. I figured maybe the first line somebody could hold it with the downhold grip, and other people held it the other way. So I have a wild mixture in my battles of various hoplites holding it various ways.
Oh, that's interesting.
I have a little problem with the overhand because when like I'm not an expert. I do I do medieval reenactment, but I have never done hoplite reenactment. But when I tried to hold my spear above my head, it was really easy to like knock it to the side, and then it would hit somebody behind me to the head.
That's interesting.
So it feels like a really unstable position to me.
We did some tests at the Plataea reenactment actually, and we found that because the ancient Greek spears were counterweighted on the back, that it actually swung back round really quick if it was parried. And we found we managed to get, I think we had about 60 guys in the phalanx that we made, and we found that holding it overarm just worked practically more in the tight formation. But in sparring situations, we had a massive variety of some choosing to have it underarm and some choosing to have it overarm, and I personally switched a lot depending on what I tried to do.
Yeah.
So I think maybe in most Vase depictions we see overarm in formations. I like, again, you sort of emphasize the no uniform training in the thing. So I think that works really well in the way that you're trying to show it. But I think it's probably more likely, I think most ancient Greek reenactors and historians tend to side on the overarm grip being used in formations. But again, that is completely a creative choice, and many instances that type of thing is not used in film. But I still think on the whole you captured the phalanx really well. It was a little bit open, it was a little bit more of like a chaotic look, but I think that it's still really sort of, you got the fact they were in a formation shield wall and they were fighting against the Persians, which were also decently formationed as well in the battle when you see them coming over the hill. And I think that you really captured the sort of scale and difference in the armies really nicely.
That's great. I hit a lot of technical limitations, so not everything that I wanted to depict properly I could do, because time constraints and even some animations didn't work. So especially the overhand animations didn't look as cool as the underhand. It was various forces pulled me to all sides, and I tried to steer it as historically correct as I could.
Yeah, and I think again that you did it really well. And I don't have the animation side of it. Well, I would love to try animation at some point. I don't know how. I'm assuming you have to make models and then they have to have movements and you apply the textures to the movements and stuff like that. But and obviously a film is supposed to look cool. So going for the choice that visibly leaves an impression, I think is a good choice when you're trying to depict something that's cinematic.
One thing that actually really made me happy was that people from Iran, they seem to be happy as well. So I didn't really want to depict Persians as those as sort of losers that they tend to be depicted in other films or from this era. So I was happy that even though I didn't really emphasize that they lost the Battle of Marathon, and it wasn't essential for the story, so I didn't use to. But even though it is one of their biggest loss, they seem to be very happy with how they're depicted.
Yeah. I think it's really important that there's always at least two sides to history, and the Persians, from the Greeks' perspective, were invading, but from the Persians' perspective, they were a super advanced empire that actually gave their occupants a lot of religious freedoms and stuff like that. And I think there's sort of I touch on this in the end of my documentary that I made on the battle. There's almost a second version of history where if the Persians won Marathon and beat Athens, that they could have actually improved the way of life in the West, and they would have probably stopped the Greeks from fighting each other in the Peloponnesian Wars, and they would have sort of stopped them from warring each other and unified them under the Persian banner, but they would have also been free to exercise their own sort of creations and religions, which I think is a really interesting sort of way. We won't be able to tell because it didn't happen, but it's sort of an interesting thing to think about, is actually what would happen if the bad guys of the battle won. from the Greek perspective. It's sort of it's a really interesting thing to think about. I think that again you captured it. It wasn't good versus bad. It was, this is our main character fighting just an opponent.
And actually, the opponent in the book I'm writing, I give a lot of space to even for the Persian characters. So I need to do some more studying on that topic. But there's a lot of Persian characters. Some are good, some are bad. Mostly, I depict them the way I think it probably was, that they were this proud nation that essentially had a good idea for running an empire, but there, like much of it was buckling under the weight of the empire because there were so many different nations and different rules, and not everything worked together flawlessly. So yeah, I don't really have a bad opinion of them. I want to depict them as good, like as real as possible, as
people,
far as
basically.
We know. Yeah, as people.
So I think you did that really well. So Heroes of Bronze, really enjoyed the short film. I'd highly recommend, if you haven't watched it, to go and check it out. And thank you so much for coming on. I've really appreciated talking to you, and I hope that you enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, thank you too. I'm glad to talk to somebody else who is really interested in this period. So I don't have that many people around me here in Czech Republic.
Yeah. If you ever need any help on any historical things, feel free to reach out and happily help you on the projects. I think they're really cool. Yeah, thank you so much.
No worries. I'm glad I had this opportunity.
All right, lovely talking to you.
You too.